morning. Okay, you came back. That's a good sign. I want to thank you for joining us on day 2 of Standards Institute. I had a little bit of opportunity to walk by some rooms yesterday. I saw a lot of heads scratching. I saw a lot of, I call it the church finger, wait a minute. I saw a lot of people taking notes. And so I want to continue to encourage you to push one another. I hope you don't mind, but I want to have a conversation with you today. And I figured that you all are my collective community, and if I couldn't have this conversation with you, I wouldn't be able to have the conversation with anyone else. So I hope you don't mind that I take a few minutes and tell you a little bit about a journey that I've been on. Is that okay? And I hope that in this journey that I talked to you about and that my colleague is going to share with you today, that you too will also see a little bit of your journey. So I'm going to ask you to do 2 things. One, I'm going to ask you to take out whatever device you use to take notes, because the journey that we want to talk to you about has specific spots we want to stop at. I'm going to ask that one of the first notes that I want you to jot down is that I want you to notice. I want you to notice how you feel. I want you to notice what you're thinking as we describe to you this journey that we've been on. And in your noticing, I want you to be able to reflect what is actually going on. You see, this morning, I want to have a courageous conversation with you. I want to be able to admit to you some things that have happened and some decisions that I've made and some things that I've witnessed. And in order to have this courageous conversation, I have to lean on Glenn Singleton's 4 agreements. I'm going to ask that you stay engaged with us this morning. There are some things that we're going to talk about for some of us in this room are going to seem kind of prickly. There are things that I want to bring up and bubble up to the surface for some of us in this room that are going to want to push back. And so I'm going to ask that you push yourself to stay engaged and notice when you're not engaged, okay? I'm going to really lean into and speak my truth this morning. You see, one of the things that I've grown to understand is that in order for me to be able to have a courageous conversation, I have to speak my truth, because when you speak your truth, there's reconciliation, and there's no way we can go about this work without reconciling some of the feelings and experiences that we've had. I know I can't. So I'm going to speak my truth, and when I speak my truth, I'm going to ask that you insert some kind of mercy. See, my truth may be prickly to some, and my truth may strike others. And so I'm going to ask that you listen with some mercy, because some of you are going to want to dismiss my truth. I'm going to ask that you experience some discomfort this morning, because the conversation that my colleague and I want to have with you is not a comfortable conversation. But it's a conversation that's necessary if we are committed to changing and moving and shifting the lives of the children and the communities that we serve every day. And finally, I'm going to ask that you accept and expect that there are some things that we're going to talk about this morning that you're not going to have closure about, that I'm not going to have closure about. And that's not the purpose of the conversation anyway. The conversation is, as my grandmother used to say, to name the thing the thing. So do you mind if we have the courageous conversation this morning? Okay. So in my travels and journeys, I've been so privileged to be able to move across this United States, and my colleagues and I oftentimes get invited to schools and to walk with our colleagues and to observe lessons, all in the name of wanting to make ourselves better. And oftentimes when I'm invited to go different places, oftentimes I'm met with some angst. And this one particular time, the angst came through an email. Let me read it to you. Dear Mrs. Robinson, I heard that you and your team are coming to observe our classrooms to better understand how our district and leaders can support us. While I am sure you hold an open mind to observing schools, my colleagues and I are apprehensive about participating in the walkthrough. Normally, I'm very willing to open my classroom to visitors. I've heard your talks and will admit that I do not agree with everything. I'm willing to participate if only we discuss my lesson. Please understand, I choose to teach at this school because I want to make a difference in the lives of these children in this neighborhood. I believe with the right behavior, attention in class, and lots of effort, they can succeed. Although I would not doubt you have visited many schools like mine, you do not know my kids. I got to that letter and email was like, she told me. Many of them come to school without complete uniforms, no school supplies, and their parents and guardians are only seen when there's an incident in school. Our students struggle with reading and comprehension of the new curriculum, and because most of them are way below grade level. In addition to this, we have an ever-growing population of English learners, so we work hard to make sure they feel included in the classroom. We would like to spend our time with you and your team learning about how to teach our students who are struggling and seem not to value their learning. And we felt that it was important to highlight these things to you. Well, I got to the end of that email and I have to tell you, I had a rush of emotions. I was saddened, angered, deflated, and inflamed. So I got up to do what I usually do when I receive an email like that. I got something to drink. Don't worry, it was water. And as I was making my way back from the kitchen and thinking about how I was going to respond to the email and vacillating back and forth because I knew the teacher that sent this email didn't mean any ill will, and I knew the teacher that sent this email, just like me, worked hard to try and create a classroom culture where her students wanted to learn. And I knew this teacher, much like I did, dedicated a lot of hours and times to lesson planning and professional development and buying supplies and meeting with their other teachers and meeting with the parents. And even though I knew all of that, it pissed me off. I said it was a courageous conversation. But as I was walking back to my office, the television was on. And out of the TV, I heard this.
My dear fellow clergymen, while confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling my present activities unwise and untimely. Seldom do I pause to answer criticism of my work and ideas. If I sought to answer all the criticisms that cross my desk, my secretaries would have little time for anything other than such correspondence in the course of the day, and I would have no time for constructive work. But since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill and that your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I want to try to answer your statement in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms.
In that moment, Dr. King snatched me back. You see, on April 12, 1963, Dr. King was arrested for parading without a permit. Dr. King and his colleagues were called to Birmingham out of concern for the lack of movement of desegregation in that town. Segregation that should have been eliminated well over 100 years prior to the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. As I sat and listened to Dr. King and heard the background story, they spoke about that he often spoke of his frustration of always having to explain to his young children why they couldn't go to the local amusement park, why the popular hamburger place wasn't for them, and even still more, when they traveled, why there were certain bathrooms that him and his family and his wife, his children, couldn't stop in. This and many other instances propelled King time and time again to confront the segregationist policies that pushed his children to only survive and not thrive. And so it would happen that Dr. King didn't just go to confront the segregationist mentalities in Birmingham that day. He was also met with some of the contention from his fellow clergymen, colleagues who had taken time out to write an open letter in the local newspaper, imploring King and his colleagues to peacefully obey the decisions of the courts and to abandon their public demonstrations. In other words, King was being asked to focus on the technical process of desegregation and not the adaptive work of going in and protesting to change mindsets. You see, King's letter, as I sat and listened to it being read aloud, began to strike me that he was writing the justice in the details in that letter back to the clergymen. He helped me recognize that my fellow colleagues that sent me that letter, that email that day, they didn't want to focus in the justice in the details. They just wanted to focus on the details. That email, I believed, held the same tenets that King met that day when he opened that newspaper. You know, the tentacles of passive resistance. And it made me realize that as a collective community, we oftentimes lean into that passive resistance. Most of the time, when we are asked, people just want to know, can you tell us how to get our students out of their achievement gaps? You know, I couldn't really blame the teacher, because oftentimes when we go in and we talk to our fellow educators about the details, about the justice in teaching and learning, oftentimes they're conflicted. Oftentimes they look at us and they're like, I dedicate all of these hours to preparing my lessons, to setting up my classroom, and now you want me to stop and look inside myself? Well, yes. And I have to be honest with you, I didn't answer the teacher back because I couldn't figure out which way or how I wanted to explain myself. And I thought, you know what? I better just show up to the school so that we could have a conversation about the justice in the details. And so I found myself making my way to the school that day. I parked my car, and I have to tell you that when I go to visit schools, I've learned to do as the children do. So I walked out of my car, and I watched children walk across the playground and line up, and so I walked across the playground and lined up behind them. And I noticed that as we were standing in line and the line was moving forward, children were being shifted. See, some children were being told to go this way to the academy, and other children were being told to go this way to the collegiate prep. And I began to wonder what it felt like when you stepped up to the person that was standing at the door and said, "Oh, no, 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 you need to go this way." Well, I found out quickly. I got up and I smiled up in the young man's face and I said, "I'm here to visit a classroom." He said, "Oh, you're here for collegiate prep." "No, I'm here for the academy." And he said, "Are you sure?" "Oh, I'm quite sure I'm here for the academy." And he said, "Well, you're not dressed like you're here for the academy. If you just go up the stairs to the collegiate office." "No, sir, I am here to go to the academy." And he kind of shrugged his shoulders and stepped past and let me by. You see, the curious thing that I was wondering about is that when I looked at the data of both the academy and the collegiate prep, the data seemed the same of everywhere I go. You know, about 72% African American, 15% Latino, 9% white, 4%, I love how they say this, all other. They struggled in ELA, about 31% proficiency and 52% in math. I knew that right away, I didn't even have to look at the data, that there was going to be an achievement gap by race. What was even more striking, though, was I began to see where the differences sort of shifted out. You see, the students in the academy were 7 times more likely to be suspended than their white peers. And the Latino students in the academy were 7.5% more likely to be suspended than their white peers. And so I began to wonder, what did it do to the psychological process of a child that stands in line and is told, "You need to go that way"? But I tucked it in because, you know, I had received that email and I thought, you can't come through the door and tell them off right away. I mean, she sent you an email to tell you to shut up. So I made my way down the hallway, and one of the first things I noticed about the academy was that the students were standing in line with their books held tight, and they were being sort of shuffled down the hallway. And as I moved on, because I have to be honest with you, at first it didn't really strike me because I too used to make my middle school students walk in a line like that. Oh, not just in the beginning of the school year. But I made my way down into the lower grades, and I noticed that students were being lined up and asked to hold bubbles in their mouths. And at that point, my spidey sense went off. I began to think, what is it that brings us to the point where we ask students to file into a school standing in straight lines with their arms down to their sides and bubbles in their mouths? You see, it struck me quite odd because the week prior to that, I was in a very large urban suburban school system, and I walked into a middle school and the kids were meandering down the hallway talking about what they had done in class, what they wanted to do, and no one was standing in the hallway shuffling them, asking them to stand in line or keep their hands to the side. And I began to reflect, what makes us as educators decide that those kids get to meander to class, but those kids have to walk in a line? What are we saying to our kids when we commit to upholding a code of conduct that says that you don't get to be free in this community, and we're afraid that if we ask you to meander, that things will break out and we won't be able to control you? What is the difference between that child and that child? I turned to my fellow educator who was walking to school with me, and I said, what made you decide? You see, I had to put on my simulationist voice so I wouldn't scare her. I can't really tell you what was going on in my head. And I said, what made you decide to adhere to this code of conduct? And she said to me, "Oh, Miss Robinson, We want our students to feel safe and orderly when they come to school. And I said, Because I began to wonder, how safe and orderly is it when you know that the people who are expecting you every day don't feel comfortable enough for you to walk to class as a human being? And I have to tell you that in that moment, I heard King. See, King reminded us in that letter that an unjust law is a code that is numerical or a power majority or group that compels a minority group to obey but does not make it binding on itself. So I wondered how many of those teachers would commit themselves to walking down the hallway with bubbles in their mouths. But, you know, the email told me to just come in and look at the details. And so I continued to make my way down the hallway. But, you know, I had to stop and ponder before I got into the classroom because, you see, I don't believe that we intentionally come to school and set up shop to make students feel like they're dehumanized. I don't believe that we as educators sit around tables and ask ourselves, what's a way that we can make these children not feel welcomed? What I do believe is that if we don't stop as a collective community and consider why we hold these beliefs, where they actually come from, we will continuously regenerate the segregationist practices that Dr. King was working so hard to fight against. You see, there are justice in the details. And so what I really wanted to do was pull my colleague aside and say to her, let me point something out to you. That this concept that you have didn't just come out of anywhere. Oh, it started a long time ago. It started with the exception of school. You see, in the United States in 1647, the first public school was open. It was open only to Puritan children, children that they felt needed to learn how to read the Bible. Right away, with the inception of public school, we began to divide who can learn and who cannot. And then in 1779, Thomas Jefferson, gotta love old Tom, came up with an idea. He said, you know, I believe there should be 2 tracks in school. One for the laboring and one for the learned. You see, he believed that scholarship would allow a few of the laboring access to advanced. Jefferson says that by raking a few genuses from the rubbish, we can begin to decipher who is a learned and who is a laborer. In 1827, Massachusetts passes a law making all grades of public schools open to all white pupils free of charge. In 1830, by this time, most southern states have laws forbidding teaching people in slavery to read. And even so, around 5% became literate. And I'd like to respectfully submit to you, that is where our achievement gap started. In 1870, our Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, known as the Enforcement Act. I thought this was really interesting. It was an act that actually banned segregation in public places. Oh, but at the same time, our government was still distracting indigenous native children from their homes and placing them in boarding schools to zap them of their native language and custom and to force them into assimilation. In 1890, Louisiana passed the first Jim Crow law requiring separate accommodations for whites and blacks. And oh, by the way, at the same time, we're going to need the whites and the blacks to pay taxes, but the white children will only benefit for those taxes that are supporting the public schools. 1905, the U.S. Supreme Court requires California to extend public education to children of Chinese immigrants. 1916, Jim Crow-style segregation spreads throughout the Southwest, many Mexican Americans in South Texas and Arizona lose their voting rights, access to public facilities, and including schools that began to become segregated. And that's where they began to see signs, no Mexicans allowed. In 1924, our native indigenous Americans were finally granted U.S. citizenship. Wow. That's like giving me a key to my house. And yet, they were still being forced to attend federally funded non-reservation schools. In 1932, 150 school districts reveals that 3/4 of them are using so-called intelligence testing. Who was smart and who was not? In 1934, we began our oh-so-solid practice of redlining, outlining neighborhoods to identify the avoidance of bank investments. And this very move is what gutted our neighborhoods and created pockets of poverty that literally put up barriers to schools in those areas ever receiving any kind of equalized funding. In 1947 is where we started to try and fight back. There was the Mendez versus Westminster that held up trying to desegregate the forced segregation of Mexican American children. And of course, there was 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, because that just worked just fine. You see, we have to stop and look at this timeline, because this timeline, you all, is what started our roots in public school. This timeline is what set forth in us that it's okay to start to segregate those who can learn and those who can't. Those who can read and those who can't. Those who know math and those who don't. You see, if we're not careful and we don't stop and examine these timelines, we won't understand that these timelines started our institutional racist practices. See, institutional racism is the systematic distribution of resources and power and opportunity in our society. And it benefits people who are white, and it's the exclusion of people who are color. See, once you start institutionalized racism, it then begets structural racism. Oh, structural racism is very interesting. It solidifies us. It does that in which it builds up public policies and institutional practices and cultural representations and what's the norms that we should go by in a society. So you see, racism has a birthplace. And it has legs, and it stretches far and wide. And if we are not careful, we will continue to regenerate it. If we don't stop and think about students who are already in a red line neighborhood, who are already in a pocket of poverty, neighborhoods that have been gutted not only of their economic resources, their food resources, health care, transportation, job opportunities. And that this racist practice actually begat this, where we tried to fight back into segregation, where we had to arm little black girls with U.S. Army men in order to force their ways into schools. And this begat that. The psychological damage that students of color experienced as they were being segregated into schools, surrounded by people who didn't believe that they had a right to learn. And if we're not careful and think back, this leads to this. Oh, you can come to this school, you can get segregated, but you will be separated. And I want to respectfully submit to you that if we are not careful, this begats this. What I witnessed in that hallway, children being asked to walk to class with bubbles in their mouths. And I want to respectfully submit to you that this is a regeneration of segregation. But, you know, in the email, I was told to just focus on the details. So I put my head down and I made my way into the classroom, and it was a third grade class. And I have to tell you that I was a little relieved once I got into the room, because I sat down and I looked up at the board and I thought, okay, we are well on our way. The learning objectives are there, standing firmly on the foundation of the standards. And so I took out my pen and I got ready to jot down, and I was eagerly awaiting the teacher to start the lesson. And I noticed that all the students were ready too. And as she began to walk up to the front of the class, she started this whole rote call and response. Peanut butter, jelly. Peanut butter, jelly. We came to learn. We came to learn. Class, yes. Class, yes, yes. After a while, I was like, yes, peanut butter, jelly. I forgot where I was. And then I realized as I looked down, 10 minutes of peanut butter and jelly that did nothing to expand those students' thinking. Sure, they were sitting up straight, their arms were ready to learn, but what in fact were they learning? What in fact was being taught to them in that moment? That in order to get your education, it takes me 15 minutes to capture your attention. And as long as you're sitting astute and straight with your arms clasped on your desk, I know you're ready to learn. I felt it bubbling back up again. You see, what I knew that teacher could not have understood was that aligned curriculum purposefully asked her to pass out the text that was supposed to be read and place it in front of the children, and that she was supposed to spend a great amount of time asking the students to interpret the meaning of the passage. And I knew she couldn't have understood that wasting 15 minutes around peanut butter and jelly was 15 minutes away from interpreting a text. And when they have adequate enough time to interpret the text, they actually affect their proficiency in reading. And the curriculum was purposefully asking her to do that. And the curriculum had no idea that she was peanut butter and jellying the hell out of the kids. That she was choosing a policing pedagogy over a purposeful pedagogy. You see, I believe that teacher had really good intentions. I believe she intended to offer up a standards-aligned grade level lesson. But what happened was that her beliefs began to bubble up to the surface, and her beliefs became a reflection of her actions. I intend to offer up this third grade aligned lesson, but I believe that these kids need to be controlled because they could get out of control, and that would look like I didn't have control. And I don't know if these students can actually read this lesson on grade level because they're below grade level, and their fluency rate has to say something about their comprehension. Her beliefs were feeding her actions and had nothing to do with her intentions. Well, I sat like this. Because I knew that even though it was upsetting me, I knew she didn't realize what she was doing. And as I scanned around the classroom to see how the students were receiving the lesson, my eyes fell upon a little boy who was asleep. And I don't mean just asleep, I mean sleep. He was so still that I started to worry because, that instinct as a parent kicks in, and when you see a child that could be your child, you feel like you need to go over and make sure that they're okay. And so I kind of tipped over to his desk and I peered over and I watched his chest rise and fall. And I began to think about this little 8-year-old boy and his world. You see, no doubt at 8 years old, he was starting to truly value friendships, and he had probably discovered a love for competition like all 8-year-old little boys. You see, all 8-year-old little boys feel that the world is their laboratory and they want to test its boundaries. And at 8 years old, he was more aware of his surroundings and could sense when others were excited to see him and could tell when they were annoyed and frustrated by him. But what really began to tug at me was what brought him to the point of fatigue at 9:45 in the morning, particularly a type of fatigue that he could sleep through all that peanut butter and jelly. And what really began to tug at me was the frustration that I knew that this teacher had with this little boy. See, I got to witness that frustration because right before class ended, this little boy woke up. And he raised his hand, Miss. Let me tell you that if you're in the middle of the year and your students are calling you Miss and Mister, you've missed the mark of building a relationship. Miss. And the teacher continued to walk to and fro past the little boy, just as she did when he was sleeping. And I began to wonder, what made her not want to stop to at least ask, are you okay? Did you get enough sleep? Is there anything I can do to help you? And his voice began louder, and he gave that, that bathroom signal we ask all of them to use. Miss, please, can I go to the bathroom? And very quick as lightning, she responded, no, Daquan, you should have thought about that before you fell asleep. Well, Daquan put his hand down, he shrugged his shoulders, and thank God to his relief, she asked the students to line up to go to specials. And I sat there, and I wondered, oh, I'm going backwards. What made that teacher in that moment not even see Daquan as that 8-year-old little boy? And I heard Dr. King's voice that when you are harried by day and haunted by night, by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stands, never quite knowing what to expect, and are plagued with inner fears and outer resentments, when you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. And I have to tell you, watching Daquan struggle, I wanted to reach out and grab the teacher and say to her, if this was your 8-year-old little boy, would you allow him to sleep? Or would you do what you did to Daquan and continue the provision gap, not even waking him up to get his reading lesson or to find out if he was okay? And I want to be honest with you in that moment. I allowed the conspiracy of politeness to take over. I fought in my head whether or not to say something to her because she had asked me just to stick to the details of her lesson and to help her figure out why her kids was interested in learning in her classroom. And so I'm going to admit to you right now that I picked up my notebook and I walked out the classroom and I didn't say a word. You see, that conspiracy of politeness sometimes prevents us from calling out the educational malpractice that we engage in. Because you must understand that educational segregation anywhere is a threat to the justice of access to equitable instruction everywhere. And I know this struggle by that fellow educator is not a struggle that is unique to her. I know that we as a collective community individually experience that. And if you don't mind, I'd like my colleague Brandon to talk to you about his personal experience in it.
Thank you, Lacey. Truth be told, I've been that teacher that has upheld legacies of educational segregation, despite believing that my students could be successful, critical, and independent learners. And this is because when we are not mindful, we reestablish the system through our actions and our inactions. King really highlights this when he says these words. He said, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I disagree and I cannot agree with your methods of direct action.'" If I may sample Dr. King, I would like to submit that when it came to instruction, there were moments where I had preferred a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, over a positive peace, which was the presence of justice. I often had the right goal, but at times my direct actions ended up being something totally different. And if you don't mind, I'd like to tell you how moments in my teaching and learning got used as stumbling blocks, as King calls them, in my students' strides toward intellectual and professional freedom. And how instructional choices unintentionally fed a systemic devotion to the order of segregationist practices rather than to justice. Several years ago, I had the opportunity of teaching this young man named Jeremiah. He was a 7th grade student of mine, an East African refugee that had lived in the United States for a few years. He was the only student in this class that year to be classified as an English learner. He had a one-to-one English learner teacher that was able to support him for half of my ELA block. That's important for context. And he was super intelligent, rhythmic, funny, and by the way, spoke 3 languages compared to my 1.25. I like to pretend I could speak Spanish sometimes, but. And I believed he would be a critical and independent thinker that would change the world, and that my instruction would help him do that. But guess what? This kid only showed me that I was not as woke as I thought. He showed me that too often my beliefs and my actions were not always aligned. He helped me see that I still had some unpacking to do in terms of really aligning with society's expectations of Black students and English learners. He helped me see my devotion to administrator appeasement and how the actions I took because of those devotions maintained a segregationist structure. Walk with me real quick. It's our classroom circa 2012. I'm leading a text-dependent discussion. I'm laughing so hard because, look. I know I'm supposed to be talking about the justice and the instructional details, but I like to talk about the details of my outfit. And real talk as well, like Lacey just got done talking about an unjust law applying to the people, the powerless people, but not applying to the people with power. Why am I allowed to wear my big brother's clothes, but they got uniforms on? So in my outdated jabots, I was leading the text-dependent discussion based on the text A Long Walk to Water, right? I call on Jeremiah. Jeremiah, in A Long Walk to Water, what inferences can we make about Salva's emotional connections to his village based on what we read in chapter 1? He really bouts to feel hurt because, how do you say it again? He really bouts to feel hurt. Try again, Jeremiah. Mr. White, that's how I talk though. It doesn't matter. You want to go to college, right? We're going to keep pushing you on this until you get it down perfectly. Whatever, mister, call someone else then. Why did I got a conversation like this? He couldn't even get a thought out. Upon some reflection, I realized that my fear that he wouldn't get access to academic English became this weird kind of counterproductive instructional obsession that only reflected my unexplored assimilationist beliefs. I was convinced that for a black boy, especially one who was an English learner, I needed to maximize his opportunities to practice the language of power, the King's English, which in turn didn't allow the classroom to be a safe space for languages other than English or variants of English. So this and other instances similar to this, because unfortunately this is not the only time something like this went down, it discouraged Jeremiah from taking deeper dives into the text. And by the way, I'm sure a lot of you all noticed that when I supposedly corrected him, I myself was not using academic English. Right? I was using informal contractions that happened to be a little bit more mainstream, like wanna and gonna, compared to his bouts. Again, assimilationism at work. To add insult to injury, later on in the lesson, I invited all the students to get into small groups to discuss the answers to questions focused on the main character and his setting, hashtag RL73. Asking students to cite evidence for each question. Jeremiah goes to a group, but he stays silent during the discourse. And he doesn't search for any evidence from the text for at least his own understanding. But guess what, though? As long as it looked like he was listening and trying to focus, even if I could tell he was perpetually puzzled, I left him alone. I left him alone because I believed that a student's role was to try, right? If a student had the capacity, if they had that grit, they would rise to the occasion and succeed. However quiet is kept, I was also paralyzed by what I was expected to be as a teacher. I was scared of losing my professional identity and reputation as a quote-unquote good teacher. A good teacher who knows how to reach all learners, including English learners, and at least knows how to keep their kids appearing to be engaged and behave. So trying to support Jeremiah in that moment would have meant that I would have had to face an instructional shortcoming I had regarding reaching out to English learners, especially when it came to academic discourse. But instead of doing that, I just left Jeremiah high and dry to navigate the task complexities without the necessary support. I didn't ask for assistance from his EL teacher. I didn't ask for training on how to reach out to effectively serve kids like Jeremiah. I just maintained the status quo. So acting on that myth of merit, masquerading with that myth of merit. My expectations for him to succeed without providing him support discouraged Jeremiah's participation, his curiosity in my classroom, and it lowered his confidence and belief in himself to become proficient in academic English. I was expanding the order of segregationist practices instead of providing the justice of equitable instruction. But I told y'all, though, I believed in Jeremiah's success, right? I was going to help him change the world with my bomb instruction. But yet I was such a stumbling block for him. How was that possible? How could I reconcile that? Upon some reflection, I realized something real simple, but really important, especially in educational spaces, is that there is a key difference between beliefs and devotions. A belief is an idea. That's it. And as hard as it was for me to hear that and tell myself that, it's just an idea. And an idea can be flimsy. Case in point, I believe it's important for me to make sure I exercise this week. However, you can bet your check I'm not going to that gym upstairs. It's too packed, that's why, it's too packed. Too packed, too much, right? It's just an idea, right? But devotion is about what we commit to action. And when we're devoted to our beliefs, we are constantly reflecting on our actions in a way that keeps our beliefs alive in the spaces in which we are serving. Once I thought about, understood, and resolved to close the gap between my beliefs and my devotions regarding English learner instruction, I really started to question how much my actions were encouraged by my environment. Was I just trying to follow the system's expectations? And this led to the ultimate pondering. How much had I allowed my environment to alter my beliefs? Because I believed in emancipatory pedagogy. I really thought I was about that life, but here I was becoming this student's stumbling block. So it really made me ask, like, well, how much even needed to be altered? What was already dormant inside of me that just needed to be catalyzed by these outside factors? I was thinking this because I know we are influenced by systemic and internalized attachments, legacies, and habits to produce racist outcomes, even if the beliefs we have are different. All right? We are in a nation and educational system that can often work to keep our beliefs and our devotions separated, dare I say segregated, while we can mistakenly believe that our beliefs are getting the job done. King names this when he quotes the white moderate as saying, I agree with you in the goal you seek, belief, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, devotion. Which, by the way, again, was informed by systemic and internalized attachments, legacies, and habits of the Jim Crow period. Upon some reflection, I had realized that when it came to my experiences with Jeremiah and the gaps between my beliefs and devotions, I understood that I was functioning as the educator moderate, who said, I agree that English learner students should be given more opportunities for academic discourse, but I cannot agree with making the classroom more student-centered because I may lose control of it. I thought they deserved that discourse. That was my belief. But guess what my devotion was? And again, this was informed by systemic and internalized attachments, legacies, and habits of our times. I agreed that my EL students could grapple with grade level text. Belief. But I could not agree with making myself vulnerable enough to learn basic English learner scaffolds and supports for them. Devotion. Justice too long delayed by these moderate instructional practices is justice denied for all students.
So what Brandon just demonstrated for us was really the answers of how we get our students, and I love this question, out of their gaps. So how we get our students out of the cycle of the gaps of achievement, belief, and provision is that we have to be willing to admit that those are our gaps. That we have a gap in achievement when we stop becoming seekers of knowledge. That we have a gap in belief when we stop the advocacy for ourselves and when we really start to ask ourselves, what have we learned new this year? That there are gaps in the provision when we as leaders make decisions that we will sacrifice this professional development hour to make sure that we pass out all of these supplies, or that we don't want to mess up the schedule, or that my teachers may not know math and I might have to give them more opportunity to learn math. If we aren't mindful about our actions, we can actually perpetuate these segregationist structures. But there is a way. See, if we begin to look at how the institutional, structural, is then fed by the interpersonal of racism and bias, if we stop to reflect on how those things create cycles in our schools, and that the institutional started with the redlining and the structural then pursued it with the policies, and then our interpersonal is driven by the media, so that when they walk into our classroom, those brown and black bodies will need to be policed because that's what I see on TV. It is called implicit bias, and we all have it. But I want to respectfully submit to you today that we can change our world. We can change the way we think. It's called System 1 and System 2. See, System 1 is that fast response, that fight, flight, or unite response that we have. System one is fed off of the patterns that we fall into. System one is where our implicit biases and thinking just pops right out. But if we as educators take the time out, we can shift it to system two, which is really more about inquiry and reasoning and logic. And it just may stop to ask us, excuse me, first grader, how do you feel walking down the hallway with bubbles in your mouths? See, here at UnboundEd, we continuously press ourselves to push towards systems two thinking. This is why we lean on the intersection. Here at UnboundEd, we focus on standards and content and instruction, all grounded in equitable access to rigor alignment and opportunities for all. We do this with our systems two thinking by building awareness around ensuring that the adopted and the adapted curriculum is aligned to the standards. We do this by asking the question if we're actually offering up equitable and access to literature and math and the language of science. Because we know that if we are not pushing ourselves to move into systems two thinking, that we will adopt strategies and ideas about instruction that don't address the standards aligned to teaching and learning. With an intentional focus on equity, we will then perpetuate the system of equitable educational outcomes for all students. And what we notice is that if we're not stopping to ask ourselves if we're pushing out of system one into system two, that we start to take the aligned lessons and gut them of their rigor, that we begin to enter ourselves into panic pedagogy. Then let me tell you, it's suppressed by, yes, there's not enough time. Yes, they read below grade level. No, they might not have the conceptual understanding of math. But if we're not careful, we will continually perpetuate this segregationist thinking and being in school. And then ask ourselves, why can't these children just learn? We have to stop and push ourselves into system two thinking in mathematics. We have to affirm that our students are mathematic learners and that they have identities in that. We have to promote student participation and value their different ways of contributing. We have to go deep with mathematics. And what I mean by that is we have to develop the students' conceptual understanding, which just may mean that we have to develop our own conceptual understanding of math. And that we must understand that the conceptual and the procedural and the problem solving and the reasoning all must flow together. We have to really press our students to leverage multiple mathematical competencies and use students' different mathematical strengths as a resource for learning. We have to challenge the spaces of marginality in math, distributing mathematical authority to the student, and present it as interconnectedness among students, teachers, and the text. In ELA, we have to think through the role of language and how it specifically applies to English language learners and students who speak English in a variant way. We have to understand the intellectual capacity of a child to hold 2 and 3 languages in their head at the same time and honor that. We have to build the expertise teachers need to support students' access to success with strengthening aligned ELA curriculum. We have to practice, and y'all know this sits right there in my heart, the systematic and explicit phonics instruction. And Lord, have us mercy. We need to have some serious conversations about remediation. The remedy, not the perpetual place that we put children. Remediation is not in lieu of class time. We have to ask ourselves if our remediational practices are forging together segregationist practices that are telling the student that you don't have the intellectual capacity to understand Shakespeare because you can't read it fluently. We have to understand that even though our students may stumble in their words, their intellect can still carry their comprehension of a text.
Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly.
We have to commit to pushing past the conspiracy of politeness and to have the gall that Dr. King asserted, so that when they push back and say, these are my kids, we can lean forward and say, there are children. We are all connected. I have to tell you, those words by Dr. King drew me back because I left that school that day not saying a word, and I got home and Daquan sat in my heart because I knew that Daquan was getting dressed, walking back to that school, asking to walk down the hallway with a bubble in his mouth, only to get to a classroom where a teacher looked at him and saw a nobodiness. And it plagued me that I walked out of that building and left Daquan to his own devices. But I tell you what, King's words of interconnectedness propelled me to pick up the phone and to call the leader of that school to say, we need to have a courageous conversation. Because justice too long delayed is justice denied. And justice is here now. And it's in the details of teaching and learning. Thank you.